So think about where the pollen might be produced. What part is the male part? What part is the female part? And I do realize that the picture on the PowerPoint is not the same as the picture you have. Slightly different. There's a few boxes missing, but do your best. There is a word bank on the right. That word bank is associated with the second part. I'm not concerned with that so much. We're just taking a look at the first part. Maybe that word bank gives you some words that you recognize that you might be able to put on the diagram. Mrs. Murdo and Mrs. Kissling are going to use this as a way to measure how effective they were
Actually,
at getting this info. No?
Never saw this in 8th grade.
No?
No, this is 7th.
No? Oh, really? So this is 7th grade stuff?
But that's okay. Those of you on 6th grade, this is still really important because,
Yeah, but he doesn't, I asked him, and he does not teach this necessarily like, they say this, yeah.
Does anybody feel confident with any of their answers or what parts of a flower we might be talking about here? Feel a little confident?
Yeah, the outer is the petals.
The outer is the petal. Okay, so where's my laser pointer get to?
Fran, you should have like half of these for sure.
What?
What, do you think, from your research now?
All I do is throw plants into a blender with water. I have no idea.
All right, my laser pointer does not
If I
work.
knew that we had to do this.
So, the outer part is what we call the
Petals.
petal. So if you're looking at this, it's going to be the top one, right under where it says parts of the flower shown. That is going to be the petal. Now let me ask you this. What's the purpose of a flower petal? There's one thing we know about organisms. When we study any organism on this planet, we know that organisms have adaptations for specific functions, for specific purposes. It doesn't make any sense for an organism to spend energy and time making a flower petal if it does nothing. So what would a flower petal do?
Attract pollinators?
Attract pollinators? Anything else? All right, that's good. Attract pollinators.
It could like the flower petals might like carries like the sap and like sort of like the veins of the plant to the petals.
Okay, so it could have something to do with energy or sap, fluids that the plant needs. We'll take a look at some of the other reasons and purposes for petals in a little bit. Does anybody have any other words that could be associated with the structure and anatomy of a flower? What are the male parts or the female parts?
I know that the middle part of
The middle part,
like right here
okay?
is the pistil.
The pistil. Okay. P-I-S-T-I-L. Pistil refers to all of the female parts of a flower. And I do realize that I'm giving you all the answers now. But the pistil refers to all of the female parts of the flower. And we divide the pistil into 3 different terms. We have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So on your little paper that I gave you, all the way at the top, it looks a little bit like a funnel. That is the stigma. And then the long tube that connects the stigma and the ovary, that is the style. And then all the way at the bottom is the ovary. What's the purpose of the ovary? Same as an ovary in a mammal, like a human or a dog or a cat.
It holds the eggs.
Produces and holds eggs.
Chickens have them too.
Chickens, really anything that reproduces sexually is going to have an ovary that produces eggs. We know that we need an egg, and then we need the male portion in order for fertilization to occur. So on the right side, we have terms associated with the female. On the left side, we have terms associated with the male. Female parts, pistil, overall, stigma, style, and ovary. The male is a little simpler, and guys, just so you understand when we talk about anatomy, guys are simple. Male parts are usually simple. Female parts are usually more complicated and more complex. And that's just basic anatomy. We look at the male portion, we have the stamen, and that stamen is comprised of two parts, the anther and the filament. The filament holds the anther. And then the anther is where the pollen is actually produced.
And stamen actually has the word men in it.
I never thought of that. That's good. That's a great way to remember that. Stamen, men, male parts.
And on their pistil thing here, they have the same as style. That's pretty obvious. So the bottom is pointing to, it obviously looks like an inverted U.
The inverted U would be the ovary.
And then what's the bottom part there on this thing? Like what's the bottom?
So you could probably go with the bottom one as the ovary and then the U as the actual egg that gets produced.
Okay, so the ovary is the thing at the bottom that looks like.
Yeah, the ovary's complex. It's going to be all the way at the base of the flower. It's the most, it's tough to say it's the most important part of the flower because every part is important. If you're missing one, you won't get fertilization or pollination. But we know that the ovary, without the ovary, we don't have eggs. So a plant likes to keep that protected. That's why the ovary is down here in the center, and it's protected by all of those things. It's protected by the sepal, it's protected by the petal, it's protected by every other aspect. Pollen, on the other hand, we can easily produce, so we put that out in the open for that to spread out, because there's hundreds of thousands of millions in there. Any questions? All right, that was just meant to get you activated to see if you knew. Yes?
What's this part right here?
That would be either the ovary or the actual egg. So you can put eggs. Now, why are we talking about flower anatomy and flower structure? We're talking about flower anatomy and flower structure because in order for pollination to occur, where we have pollen meet up with an egg to produce a new plant, we need to, and I say we, the plant needs to figure out an interesting way to get that pollen from the anther down to the egg. If I go backwards 1 second, if this is my example and this is my flower, I produce pollen here. It's not very hard for me to get the pollen that's produced here up to the style, down through the stigma, down to the ovary, down to the egg, and fertilization to occur. So as a plant, if the pollen I produce in my flower can self-pollinate the flower, it's pretty simple. Everything is really close by. The problem is, a lot of times, one flower isn't able to self-pollinate. It needs to be cross-pollinated, meaning you need a plant some distance away from you that is not you for pollination to occur. So plants have developed over hundreds of thousands of millions of years this really intricate relationship with what we call pollinators. Pollinator is just a fancy way of saying an insect or an organism that facilitates pollination. When we look at that, there are three major classes of insect that we view as pollinators. And I have them represented on this screen right here. Three major types of insect that pollinate. And when we look at the order or the amount of pollination that occurs from these organisms, the first and most important organism that serves as a pollinator for plants today, those are our bees. Like this guy right here. What's that?
Guys, I would suggest suggest you jot this down, whether it be in your notebook on a new page or on the back of.
Yeah, you can write it on the back, anything along those lines.
Just take a look later.
The test will be at the end. Bees are by far the most important, most predominant pollinating insect that we see. The picture in the dead center there, that is a honeybee. But there are more than just honeybees. Honeybee is just one example. What other types of bees are there?
There's a wasp.
Wasp. Do they pollinate? Do they go to plant flowers? The only time I ever see wasps is when I'm worried about them stinging me. Ooh, you know what? We could probably investigate that. When we get out to the garden, we'll see if we see any wasps. Because maybe they do, or maybe we just think wasps go to flowers, but they might not. We'll take a look at that and see if we can observe. Wasps broadly fall under the category. They're not technically considered a bee, but they are very, very closely related. So back to some other bees.
A bumblebee.
Bumblebee. Do they visit flowers and pollinate?
What's the difference between a honeybee and a bumblebee?
Honeybee, you see on the screen, that's a honeybee. I don't have a picture of a bumblebee, but a bumblebee is about 3 or 4 times the size. They're really big, solid black sometimes. Sometimes they have a little yellow, and they sound really loud when they're flying.
Oh, what about like carpenter bees and stuff? That's a lot.
Here's my third or fourth. We have carpenter bees. Anybody know any others?
Well, there's one. I just wanted to ask, that yellow bunch on the honeybee's leg, is that like
Yeah.
a sac to hold the pollen?
It's called a pollen basket. That's where they're actually storing all the pollen. Yeah, we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Other bees.
Yellow jackets?
Yellow jackets, okay. Do they pollinate?
I don't know.
Or are they similar to wasps? Do they just annoy us and sting us?
I think they pollinate because they like sweet things. I went to an apple orchard and they were buzzing around the apples.
So they might be buzzing around the apples, going for the apple, but
Yeah.
are they actually responsible for helping that flower to get pollinated?
Well, I've just seen them around a lot of sweet plants, and since nectar is considered something sweet, I thought maybe they could probably do.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. And there's one or two more, real quickly, let me hit on. One is called a mason bee. Anybody ever heard of mason bee? They're not like honeybees. They're not like bumblebees. They're not necessarily a colony where there's hundreds of thousands of them. They're solitary. Okay? And then in general, we refer to a class of bees as what we call the ground bees. These are actually bees that nest in the soil. So there's some bees that dig tunnels and holes in the soil, almost like ants, and they lay eggs in the soil and then they emerge from the soil. That's not a comprehensive list. There's hundreds of other types of bees. I actually have a book up in the front of the classroom with about 1,000 other bees. But just so you understand, when we say bees, we're not just talking about honeybees. Usually people think honeybees when we say bee, but it's this big list. So honeybees, our number one most important pollinator. As we look at those pictures up there, which animal represents the second most important?
A butterfly?
A butterfly. Bingo. Representing the second most important, butterflies and moths. So monarch butterflies, swallowtails, butterflies and moths that you see flying at night, they are very important for pollinating as well. And then the third picture, what is this? I said we have 3 different types. We have bees, we got the butterfly. Don't worry about the hummingbird. Is that not a bee?
It looks like a fly.
It looks like a fly? Well, it doesn't look like a fly. It is a fly. And our third most important type of organism that pollinates, believe it or not, flies. And that's called a hover fly because it hovers in air almost like a helicopter. Anybody ever seen one of those? Yeah, don't swat them. They will not sting you. They will not bite you. They will not attack you. If anything, they might just drink a little bit of sweat on your skin.
Or are they the sweat bees?
Sometimes they're referred to as sweat bees or really closely related. And again, there's hundreds of different examples of them, but they make themselves look like bees, like they're big and scary, but in reality, they cannot sting, they cannot bite, they cannot harm you, and they do a lot of pollinating as well. So when we talk about pollinating insects, we usually think of bees, butterflies, and flies. But ultimately, it's any insect that is capable of transferring pollen from a flower to another flower or the same flower for fertilization to occur.
I have a question.
Yes?
Do hummingbirds pollinate?
They
Or are
have
they able to get past the pollen?
there are some birds that will be responsible or important for pollinating, but usually birds are so big and clunky that they either do damage to the flower for pollination not to occur, or in the case of the hummingbird, it's so specifically designed to draw just the nectar that it never even bumps into the anther or the pollen, and it doesn't even carry any.
And don't forget to mention that not here, but in the tropics, bats are really good pollinators.
Bats are good, yep.
But not here, or bats are insectivores here, but in the tropics, they're good pollinators for certain things.
Correct. So we have bees, we have butterflies, and we have flies in that order. What we know from our flower anatomy, when we talk about a petal being on the outside of a plant, we know that plants need to draw in an insect for pollination to occur. They do that through three general ways, and I put them up here on the screen. They do that through color, they do that through aroma or odor, and they do that through flower shape. Three basic ways that they can pull in an insect. So if you are a bee, why would you go to a flower? You would go to a flower if it attracts you through its color. So some plants will modify their petals so that their color is vibrantly orange, or purple, or red, or white. So the color of the petal can attract the insect. Sometimes a plant will use smell, odor, aroma. And right here, this plant is pulling in pollinators by smell. That's called a corpse flower. When it is in bloom, it smells like rotting meat. If you're an insect, which of these three insects are going to be drawn to a flower that smell like rotting meat? Flies more than butterflies and moths and bees, exactly. So the corpse flower, it gets pollinated by flies. It has evolved this strategy to attract a pollinating insect by making its flower smell like a dead, decaying, rotting organism. And then other flowers go the opposite way. They make themselves smell really good. Think about rose, carnation, some of the flowers that we use in cut flowers and vases, right? So flowers can smell good or bad, but they're still drawing in pollinators. And then third, the shape of a flower. Here's an example of a really intricate flower shape. What does that look like? It looks like a wasp. That's actually a flower of an orchid. Its flower looks exactly like the wasp that pollinates it. So it uses mimicry. So if you're a wasp flying around, all of a sudden you see that. I'm a male wasp, I see that, I say, wow, that's a female wasp of my species. I'm drawn to that. I land on it thinking it's a female. When I land on it, I touch the anther, I pick up the pollen, I go to another flower, I transfer the pollen, voila, pollination. So what's really intricate here is that these plants, no matter which plant you look at that is flowering, every plant has a strategy for attracting a pollinator. Some of them use all three, maybe a little bit of color and a little bit of smell and a little bit of shape. Some of them use only one and are very specific, but each plant has developed its specific strategy for drawing in a pollinating organism. What we're going to look at today, is the frequency of pollinators visiting flowers and the pollen that they're picking up. Before we do that, one final note here about plants and anatomy and structure and why these plants do the things they do. Plants pull an insect in through flower shape, through color, through aroma. What does the insect get? What does the pollinating organism get? If you are a hummingbird, why do you go to a plant to drink the nectar? What is the purpose of that nectar? What does it do for you? If you are a honeybee, why do you actually go to a flower? What benefit do you get? Because in reality, the plant is using you for reproduction. So if you're an insect, you're drawn to that plant for two main reasons. Right? You might see that it's pretty, you might smell that it's really fragrant, it might look like you, but ultimately you get rewarded as the pollinating organism through one of two ways. You either get nectar or you get pollen. Now nectar, we're all probably pretty familiar with. Nectar is really high in sugar, so it serves as a great energy source. Okay? We know things that are high in sugar are great for us. They're really sweet, taste good, all of that. Okay. If you think of it, just raise your hand when we talk about it. If you're a honeybee, you collect the nectar from a flower, you take it back to your hive, you put it back into a cell, you make honey from it. If you're a bumblebee, you might do the same thing. They might not produce honey the same way, but each organism is going to use this nectar a little differently, either consume it right away or store it for later use. So you're drawn to the flower, you get rewarded with a sugary syrup liquid, it's good for you. If there's no nectar or a little nectar, one of the other benefits to you is that you can get pollen. Because believe it or not, some insects will go to a flower in order to collect and gather just the pollen. And pollen can be very high in other essential nutrients and minerals that are necessary for organisms. So it could be high in proteins, vitamins, vitamin A or B, because believe it or not, insects and animals do need vitamins. Minerals, zinc, copper, different things like that. All of that which will be important for the organism to survive. And as a plant, here's where it gets even more interesting. You know you're rewarding the insect with nectar and pollen by coming to your flower. Come back to this slide in a second. Let's go back here. You are a flower. If you produce nectar, where in the flower are you going to store the nectar? Are you going to put it all the way up here at the top of the stigma? Remember, your insect is coming and getting that nectar. Do you want the insect to land up top here, pull nectar, and leave? Should we put the nectar out here on the petal? Where is the best spot to put the nectar?
Maybe another anther.
Right here on the anther. So put your nectar right there on the anther by your pollen. That way when the insect comes in and it touches it, it picks up the nectar and it picks up the pollen. Great idea. Is there a problem for that? See any negatives or drawbacks? Nectar's high in sugar. Anybody ever touch nectar? It's very sticky. So what if we put all that nectar up there with our pollen? Will our pollen be able to easily transfer to an insect? It's going to stick to the plant. So we probably don't want to put the nectar directly next to our pollen, next to our anther. Where else do we want to put the nectar? What's the best spot? Where should we put it?
Maybe in the stigma.
Maybe in the stigma up top here?
Yeah.
The potential for that is now the insect comes in, lands up here, never touches this, steals the nectar, and now you don't get any pollination. So where are you going to put it? It's got to be in your flower. It's got to be a reward for this thing, this bee, this wasp that's coming to you. Where are you actually going to put it?
In the ovary?
In the ovary, down here. So that would mean the insect would need to make its way all the way down the stigma, down through the style, down into the ovary to get the nectar. Any problems with that? Yeah? What's the problem?
It would hit the eggs.
It would hit the eggs. Okay, any other problems? It's really, really, really hidden. I mean, look at how tiny that is. Look at how long this is. That insect would need to have a leg or a mouth part that would reach all the way down through. So the point I'm trying to get at is it's a balancing act because a flower wants to have its nectar available for the insect, but it wants the insect to work for it. It doesn't just want to put the nectar out here for the insect to land, eat the nectar, and take off. It doesn't necessarily want to put it all the way down here because it's so hard to get to that an insect won't normally visit because it's so hard to get to. So it's got to be protected, but not too protected. And that is the delicate balance that we see with flowers and their pollinators. Each flower has an adaptation for how and where they store their nectar. So when we go outside in a minute, you go pull a flower from a plant and bring it back in, we're going to try to find out where that nectar is actually stored. How readily accessible is that nectar? And when we go outside and take a look at that flower, I also want you to consider these questions that I'm posing to you. You don't have to write any of these down. These are just 5 questions I randomly thought of last night when I was generating this for you. When we go out there, you're going to take a look at a flower. I'm going to have you go out into the garden. You're going to find a flower that is in bloom, and you're going to stand there for 5 minutes. Now, this is probably going to be the hardest part of SRI for you. For 5 minutes, I want you to stand there and just stare at the flower. Now, don't stare until the point where you pass out or get dizzy or anything like that. But I want you to stand there, sit there, and watch the flower for 5 minutes. And what I want you to watch for is if any insect comes up to that flower. And if you see an insect, jot it down, what you think its name is. Bee, wasp, yellow jacket, ant, fly, what have you. As you're sitting there, think about, is the pollen on that flower sticky? What does it mean to be sticky pollen? Think about where the nectar is, if you can see it. If not, think about the color of the flower. What color is that flower? What could it be attracting based off of its color? If you can see the anthers and the filaments, are they hidden deep down in the flower or are they out in the open? If you can see the pistil, the stigma, the style, the ovary, again, are they hidden? Are they exposed? Is there an aroma? What is the specific shape? Basically, everything we just talked about with flower anatomy. I want you to take a few minutes and just sort of observe. And on the back of this sheet, if you'd like, just jot down some observations. Anything you see relating to that flower while you're out there for a few minutes. Okay? So the next 5 to 10 minutes, here's what you're going to do. If you want to go out as a group of 2, you can, although I prefer you to do this individually. I want you to take your paper and pen, you're going to go out into the landscape laboratory and find a plant that is in bloom. I don't care if it's a white flower that's this big, or if it's a flower this big as your head. You're going to find a flower. You're going to sit there, you're going to stand there for 5 minutes and make any observations. And after that 5 minutes, approximately, you're going to take your hand, you're going to rip the flower off the plant, keeping the flower intact. You're going to bring the flower into the lab. And once we're in the lab, I'm going to show you a demonstration. What we're going to do is stain the pollen so that we can look at the individual shapes of the pollen and whether there are insects that are visiting that pollen based off the shape or color or nectar or anything along those lines. Right? So we're going to take our papers, pen or pencil, we're going to go out to the garden, spend 5 minutes on a flower of our choosing. After 5 minutes, rip it off the plant and come back into the lab.